And joining us live in studio is Craig Gradich, Executive Director for Gradish Mahura Investments. And we have Sfiso Mahlangu. He's a political and economical analyst, and we'll be joined by other guests on the line. Good evening to you, gentlemen, and thanks so much for joining us. Craig, I just want to get into why the obsession and absolute terror and fear that economies have of ratings agencies in light of the scandal that is now broken.
Yeah, I think it's very important that people understand the role that rating agencies play in financial markets. So if you consider yourself, if you went to the bank and you asked for a loan, the bank has to get a sense of your credit worthiness as an individual. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a lot more complex when it comes to countries and to businesses and to, institutions like Eskom, where they also borrow money. And lenders need to understand how do we price the debt, or how do we price this loan that we are going to give to them. And that's where the rating agencies come in, because it's a fairly complex analysis that's required to determine the credit worthiness of a country or a large corporation, a multinational corporation. So if you get a kind of an unfavorable rating, then the cost of your debt as a country and organization is a lot higher than if you were to get a more favorable credit rating. Yeah. So countries certainly pay attention to what the credit rating agencies say. And sometimes they get it wrong. And when they do get it wrong, the consequences can be quite
All right, let's invite Dr. Adrian Saville, Chief Investment Strategist with Cannon Asset Managers. Dr. Saville, thanks so much for your time. Just the ramification of what this means, especially for a country like South Africa that have been on tenterhooks, essentially, fearing junk statement and potentially even impacting on our ability to attract foreign direct investment. What does this mean?
Well, the ratings agencies probably matter far more to foreign portfolio investment than foreign direct investment. The distinction being that direct investment is bricks and mortar investment, where you are essentially buying operating assets, whereas portfolio money follows capital markets and interest rates in particular in the case of South Africa. And a call by the ratings agencies to the downside would be negative for South Africa. It would put a question mark over our ability to service debt. It would raise the cost of capital. It would raise the cost of doing business for government, and so on. Having said all of that, I think that the way that capital markets are priced already is as if South Africa were downgraded.
I guess what I want to find out is that these have always been lauded as highly reputable institutions. They own 96% of the market in terms of the credit rating space, that we are very dependent on what it is that these key credit rating agencies say about the health of the country's stability, politically, economically, etc. Is it probable that they could have also misread South Africa as they've done in the U.S. financial crisis of 2008?
That's quite possible. I think the evidence of the past decade, the global financial crisis in particular, as you flag, is that the ratings agencies did not shower themselves in glory. They were behind the curve, or even more grandly, they were simply wrong. And to imagine that, whilst the rest of society and the economics and analysts, professionals or industries are also in the job of forecasting and get things wrong, I think it would be bold to suggest that somehow the ratings agencies don't get things wrong. They do. Having said all of that, South Africa in recent years has really struggled with economic growth, which is a critical factor in establishing a rating. We sit with very stretched income inequality, entrenched unemployment, and when you put those ingredients into the cocktail, although the ratings agencies could be wrong, I don't think they are wrong on South Africa.
Okay, not just about the living circumstances and the inequality, as you mentioned, and the desperate need for economic growth that can absorb the unemployed, but I just want to look at their credibility now in light of what has transpired. And is the penalty adequate of just slapping them with the 11.7 billion rand fine or 834 million US dollars?
Well, Cindy, here's my thing. 11 billion is a drop in the ocean for them. It's not even a slice of the cake. So Moody's and the reputable and beloved of the world cite to political instability in this country, and that leads to the downgrade. I mean, they kept South Africa at BAA, and that wasn't very good because of, the political issues. They called it political pressure in the country. And that pressure cited to President Zuma's refusal to leave office. Those were one of the things to which many were saying the South African economy was not growing. So then Cabinet and the NEC would decide to vacate the president or to oust him because the South African economy is suffering because of President Zuma. And then months later comes in the news to say these people who are making these statements and have such a good reputation in our eyes actually lied or they got it wrong. So these countries, our developing countries and our Commonwealth countries, we make our decisions according to what these people say. And these representatives come from the G7 countries. They don't come from SADC. They don't come from the Commonwealth countries. And they cite all these other reasons that later affect us. So if we make our decisions according to the rating agencies, we'll be firing presidents and having cabinet reshuffles. And all they're doing is lying. That's essentially what has happened. And it's, very dilly-dally to say, well, they got it wrong. But to cite reasons to why you think South Africa is not developing, and then months later you come out and your reputation is not as sparkling as we think, I think it's unfair. South Africa and BRICS must develop their own rating agencies, because foreign markets will never rate you. Because as much as they want South Africa to grow, they are happy with keeping us as the underdogs.
Your response to this, that there is political interference, or rather there is a bias towards the US and the West as opposed to the relationship that South Africa has with the BRICS nations?
Yeah, look, I think it points to one of the shortcomings. And, there's no perfect system out there. You've got to find a system that works, universally. And when it comes to rating countries and institutions, there is an element of subjectivity. So, someone's opinion does come into it. So I haven't seen evidence of corruption per se in terms of, the rating regarding South Africa or some kind of agenda. Rating agencies, and there are three of them. There's Moody's, there's Fitch, and there's Standard & Poor's. They've been reasonably consistent with each other, even though they have differing methodologies. But I think that area of subjectivity does lend itself to debate, and then you're now dealing with shades of grey.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's subjectivity, especially if the country has been threatened. For example, if you take the Nene Gate and what has been purported to have been the ramifications thereof. We've also heard President Zuma saying that, that this is deliberately done to position South Africa as a country that is essentially on a downward spiral, as opposed to saying there is a new direction or a new wave of seeking investment and bed partners when it comes to economic growth. Dr. Savala, your response to that?
Well, I think what's going on underneath all of this is a search for fact. And perhaps a way of thinking about the ratings agencies is to imagine that they are referees in a football game. The rules of the game are known. You've got fantastic monitoring capability, but there is room for error. There's room for misinterpretation. There's also room for interpreting the same facts differently, and that point has already been made, that the criteria are different amongst the ratings agencies, what none of that changes, though, is that when you go in search of the facts, if we put up some hard numbers that give evidence of a country's ability to service its debt, to grow. You know, we could do the same thing with a household income statement, and we could say, how much do you earn? How much do you spend? Have you spent on luxury goods, or have you misallocated the household budget? So, you know, there's common sense ways of asking questions about the health of a household, a company, a country. And when you put those questions up to South Africa, I think South Africa has been given the benefit of the doubt. So far, I would actually disagree with the observation that there's political bias going against South Africa here. If anything, I think South Africa has been given a very lenient reading that by many measures, South Africa should have been downgraded some time ago.
All right, Sviso, your response.
Well, anyone is free to agree or disagree. Really, effectively, it makes no difference if you're speaking from opinion. But Standard & Poor was charged 26 billion last year for making the same error, if we call it an error. So it's not just a random event or an accident. These three major agencies are aligned to each other. The other thing, Cindy, that we must be very mindful of, and I think also as President Jacob Zuma has cited on Sunday and the 8th of January and before, is that, of course, it is good for the world if South Africa develops, but they don't want South Africa to develop because they don't want you to be a competitor. Africa must continue to be the underdog of white monopoly capital. Africa must continue to be, submerged under the rates of the Americas and the G7 countries. And so they'll never raise you to a point that you are able to compete with them. And so if you judge your rating to what your enemy says, it's always going to be low. It's time, Africa emancipates and we have our own rating agencies. It's time BRICS comes in with our own rating agencies. This is not the first. All of them have been found wanting. In some events, they did not downscale countries where they have very favorable relationships with, countries where they do the most business, where Standard & Poor does the most business. Those countries always blossom in their eyes. That's very serious corruption. But of course, one would not cite that because we're looking at ourselves as a dismantling nation. And we even make statements like, the world has been very lenient. These agencies have been very lenient on South Africa because when you look at a black government, we always expect things to be falling apart. And when they don't downgrade us, we say they are lenient. When they do downgrade us, we say their observation was true. I think there's something really wrong with our moral compass and our political observation in this country.
So you're essentially saying rating agencies are overrated and going with the narrative that the BRICS nations should come up with their own rating agency to dismantle the stronghold, as it were,
Absolutely.
that current rating agencies have.
Look, I will disagree because South Africa was investment grade in 2004, 2005. And as our economic position deteriorated, the currency is weakened, the fiscal position is weakened, economic growth is not there. So, it's not as if there's been this agenda. I don't know where it comes from that it wasn't there in 2004 to 2006. And suddenly it's there now. I think, when you're assessing the creditworthiness of a country or a corporation, and in fact, even medical aid schemes are rated by credit agencies because yourself as someone taking out a medical scheme, you want to know that that scheme has the ability to pay if you ever find yourself in hospital. So the rating agencies, their role goes beyond countries, it goes beyond organizations, and they've been getting things right for many years. They've gotten it wrong 97, 98 with the Asian crisis, Russian debt, mispricing of debt there, a couple of examples in the 80s, but you do it right for 10 years and nobody writes a headline. And then you get it wrong once and a few times, and yes, it was quite spectacular in 2008. But then we fix it and we can go forward.
I don't know if we can just easily treat the report necessarily as being benign, that it's something that was either human error or was it misguided or lack of judgment, because these were junk deals in effect that were sold and inflated that led to the ballooning of the property market and affected the world over. So how do you then justify that kind of mistake, especially in our case where we cannot now look at the agencies without any, as if they have no reproach.
No, sure. So I'm not saying that that's the case. In 2008 they got it wrong, and they were wrong on they were almost amateurish in how they assessed these loans and how these pools were created and sold off as credit, as a credit rating, when in fact they were being loaned to people that could not pay those loans back. So there they got it wrong. But the point I'm making is that they get it right a lot, and they, so it's not news headlines when they do. I can't see the evidence that there's some kind of agenda against emerging markets.
One can openly say, they've had it right for so long. Why did they get it wrong now? But who's been the judge of all these other instances where they supposedly got it right in inverted commas? Who was the judge? If we just try and overlook 2008, where people lost houses, cars, it was a world economic crunch down. Things fell apart. And then we can, overlook that and say, well, a mistake has happened and it was a human error. Let's just go on because they've got it so right for so many years. Who was the judge? We don't know whether they've been getting it right. But now the ice cream has hit the fan because things are coming out into the open and fines are being paid and it's coming to exposition. So just because something has not been rationalized or something has not been made aware or has come to our enlightenment at a certain point in time, it doesn't mean it has not been happening. I think their credibility moving on, South Africans, whenever you talk about Moody's or any other rating agencies, we've got to be very skeptical. And I mean, if you sell me a cranky deal, the next time you try and sell me something, the next time I've got to question, how is this real? Why are you giving me the real thing right now? I think their reputation is heavily dented.
Dr. Saville, do you think that they can get away now with a disclaimer that, errors or they're not liable necessarily if certain things happen, or that there's even a safety net, a cushion where they can pay off a penalty and merrily move along without necessarily the respective countries in which they operate treating them with further scrutiny on previous ratings that have been made that could have affected the outcome of the results?
I think a number of points made in this conversation are important, and we can't lose sight of them. The first one is that these ratings agencies have got things wrong, so they are not beyond reproach. They have made mistakes. I think the second one that is a very valuable point is that there is more than ample scope for a need for checks and balances, that you do have a disproportionate or an exclusive representation from agencies that are rooted in the Western world, in advanced countries. And so they have, what historically was called the Washington Consensus as their frame of reference. And there's nothing that says the Washington Consensus is right and that the Washington Consensus is the only way to build a healthy economy. Look no further than examples like South Korea or Singapore. But perhaps the third point is that when you think of the impact of these ratings agencies, I use the example of a football referee. Perhaps a more appropriate example would be a judge. And when a judge gets things wrong and puts someone in prison for 10 years and then after the fact says, wow, I'm sorry, I got it wrong, and you release the person from prison, you cannot reverse the clock. You can't undo the damage. You can pay compensation for that damage. but you cannot reverse the clock. You can't create a parallel reality. And so there's no escaping the fact that these ratings agencies have an incredible obligation on them, and that obligation is to get things right.
And Dr. Saville, thanks so much for your time. And it's a question of trust going forward, I'm sure, with all its clientele and the various economies that they serve. But thanks indeed to our panelists as well. Craig Gradich, who is the Executive Director for Gradich Mahura Investments, Sfiso Mahlangu, a political and economical analyst, and on the line, Dr. Saville. Thanks to you at home for joining us. Stay tuned for Clive Ramatibela Smith. He's up next with Biz Pulse.